Today we're unpacking a really fascinating alternative history laid out in a 1986 text called Last of the Celts by Oda Blighty. And the core argument we're looking at today, it's pretty wild. The author claims that almost everything we think we know about ancient Europe, and the Celts in particular, is entirely wrong.
Right from the very start, the text throws down a massive counterclaim. It challenges the accepted historical view by asking us to imagine a world where the Celtic legacy isn't just some minor footnote in European history, but is actually hidden in plain sight as the very foundation of a global civilization.
So, to make sense of this huge claim, here is our roadmap. We're going to look at the alleged historical cover-up, trace the author's claimed Middle Eastern origins, examine the geographical maps, investigate the linguistic evidence, and finally we'll see exactly how this legacy was lost.
All right, Part 1. The Great Historical Cover-Up.
The inciting incident for this whole alternative history is the idea that the ancient world was subjected to a deliberate, massive rewriting of facts. Think about what we're usually taught, right? Standard history says the Celts were European barbarians, largely illiterate, who were eventually conquered by civilized Rome and Greece. But the author claims the exact opposite. He argues the Celts were actually an incredibly advanced, pre-Greek literate civilization, and he says that Mediterranean kings who were basically jealous of this older culture actively rewrote history to paint them as savages.
According to the text, the Romans and Greeks essentially executed a massive cultural erasure. The author views historical decrees, like the famous Roman order to destroy Carthage, as part of a systematic effort that was so thorough it effectively wiped the memory of this foundational Celtic civilization straight from the historical record.
Which brings us to Section 2, a Middle Eastern origin.
Now you might be wondering, if they didn't originate as European barbarians like the Romans claimed, where does the author say these Celts actually came from? Well, the book posits that the roots of the Celtic civilization actually trace back to the ancient Chaldeans of the Fertile Crescent. So the author is essentially linking their origins to the cradle of civilization itself, rooting them in places like ancient Babylon long before they ever set foot in Europe. When we map out the author's highly revisionist dates, we see a completely alternative timeline. In this version of history, around 4500 BC, a literate Chaldean civilization migrates from Mesopotamia into Europe. Then, around 2500 BC, as Egyptian trade starts to decline, these ancient mariners supposedly transfer their bases to Arabia. And then, much later, around 500 BC, the Greeks allegedly rewrite history, taking this long-established Celtic presence and rebranding it as a brand new wave of incoming barbarians.
And get this, the text goes even further. It suggests that a branch of these early Chaldean Celtic peoples migrated into North Africa and actually founded the very civilization that built the great Egyptian monuments, like the pyramids. It's a breathtakingly large reimagining of human migration.
Moving right along to Section 3, Pioneers of the Seas.
Here is where the author completely transforms the Celts from landlocked warriors into masters of a global maritime empire. He argues that the word Phoenician actually derives from a Celtic word meaning plower of the sea. He insists that famous ancient seafaring groups like the Phoenicians, the Sabians, and the Homerite were actually all part of the exact same Celtic-speaking civilization. They were just using different names to run the same global trading network. We're talking about a massive commercial network here. The book claims these Celtic mariners operated trade routes stretching all the way from the Red Sea, down around the coasts of India, and all the way over to the Bay of Bengal.
And ultimately, according to the author, these global trade routes connected the Eastern Mediterranean and ancient Arabian ports all the way back up to Atlantic Europe, forging vast, early connections straight into Ireland.
So, on to Section 4, the map's hidden language.
Now, what is the hard evidence the author uses to back up all these massive geographical claims? Well, the crucial point here is a linguistic puzzle. The text argues that if you apply the Celtic language to ancient maps drawn by the Roman geographer Ptolemy, suddenly these unmeaning Eastern place names become highly descriptive and logical. For instance, Indus translates to Old River. Sina, mountain, means round hill or mount. And Ilana, on the Red Sea coast, directly translates to the eye or swampy plain inlet.
But it's not just basic names. The author claims that many of these names acted as a hidden, functional language for these ancient mariners, essentially an ancient warning system encoded entirely in Celtic. So Ision Geber was a warning of a bad or dangerous harbor. Tamala warned of wet, oozy, swampy lands, and Tindus, off the coast of India,
alerted sailors to a rapid but shallow river. For the author, this linguistic overlay is the absolute smoking gun. He believes it proves that the ancient trading world wasn't mapped by Greeks or Romans at all, but was actually navigated and named by a globe-spanning civilization speaking archaic Celtic.
Finally, Section 5, the fading Celtic legacy. So if this empire was so vast, how did it dwindle down to a struggling heritage? The text paints a pretty dark picture of the 19th century, arguing that the ancient language was decimated by a perfect storm of forces. You had the undeniable ravages of the famine, you had the heavy-handed imposition of English by the privileged classes, alongside the 1830s abolition of intermediate education. But fascinatingly, the text also places blame squarely on Celtic scribes themselves. It claims they selfishly refused to adopt the printing press just to maintain their lucrative monopoly on handwritten texts, essentially choking their own language out of existence.
Now, there was a lot of pushback, of course. Despite fierce protests from scholars at Trinity College and other institutions against these educational bans, the source notes that the living memory of this archaic language reached its absolute lowest ebb. Ultimately, it left only a scattered handful of people, the literal last of the Celts, who were capable of actually interpreting the ancient manuscripts.
Whether you view this text as a profound, uncovered truth or just an eccentric linguistic theory, it certainly leaves us with a compelling question. If an entire global history could theoretically be lost in the translation of ancient maps, what other secrets might old languages be hiding in plain sight today? It really makes you wonder how much of human history is shaped entirely by who gets to write the dictionary. Thanks for joining me for this explainer.